hearing in the press again and again, culture war is just a distraction. It doesn't matter. You know, why aren't we talking about the cost of living crisis, all the rest of it? Is there a point there?
Well, you could say that about almost any other issue than the cost of living crisis, couldn't you? But it's obvious that these issues matter. If they didn't matter, then the candidates wouldn't feel the need to address them, and Penny Mordaunt wouldn't be in such a mess over her previous statements on the trans issue and her desperate attempt to walk that back now. I think we're seeing that this is in response to what members and voters in the public do care about. It's not the only issue they care about, but it's certainly one of them.
So just talk us through what exactly happened with Penny Mordaunt, because some people may not be aware of the whole problem.
So Penny Mordaunt, when she was in the Equalities brief, she had essentially taken a pro-self-ID stance. So this was this reform that Theresa May's government wanted to bring in, which would allow someone to transition, would remove requirements for a diagnosis and for certain conditions being met, and it would basically become a matter of self-declaration.
So you could say, I am a man, I am a woman, and then have access to various spaces and
Exactly,
services.
and that was obviously the threat, was that it would be essentially just get rid of the idea of sex-based rights, if that was the case. She appeared in the House of Commons, very famously from the dispatch box, said, I want to be clear, trans women are women, trans men are men, but has since been trying to completely backtrack on all of that, and not very successfully, it's got to be said. There was reports in the Sunday Times today essentially proving that she did back gender self-ID, which is the complete opposite of what she's saying.
Well, because it was interesting in that first debate, because Kemi Badenoch was saying that when she came into that department, that was very much the stance that had been taken before. And she even said at one point to Liz Truss, tell the truth, Liz, say what Penny Mordaunt stood for here. So, but how damaging could that be, do you think?
I think it could be really damaging. First of all, it's the dishonesty of it more than anything else. I mean, the only conclusions you can draw is that Penny Mordaunt just kind of goes whatever the way the wind is blowing, or she's lying and misrepresenting her own views.
Or she could change her mind, perhaps?
Well, I think the thing is, in terms of how she's dealt with this, it's not entirely clear that she has changed her mind. She's trying to claim that her position has always been the same. That's clearly not the case. And I think even on the level of dishonesty, that's going to go down.
You know, I've read a lot about Kemi Badenoch as well, being the culture warrior candidate. There was an article in the Metro saying that the fact that she's going on about these wedge issues, but actually is women's rights, racial relation, are those wedge issues? I thought they're quite serious issues, aren't they?
Not at all. I think referring to it as a wedge issue, or you also hear the thing about the Tories are stirring up a culture war or launching a culture war, I think it tries to trivialise what, as you were suggesting, they're really important things. You know,
free speech, quite important.
Freedom of speech, sex-based rights, how we see ourselves as a society. I mean, one of the things that Kemi Badenoch has very articulately pushed back against is this new racial politics, is this idea that, again, colour of the skin matters much more than content of the character, that essentially we're a society riven with racism and therefore we should all be quite suspicious of one another. That's a really damaging narrative to be out there. So to suggest that the people who are hearing all of these quite extreme, to my mind, views and saying, I'm not sure about that, are the ones who are trying to weaponise these issues or start a culture war, gets things completely the wrong way round.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. It's people effectively responding to the culture war, not starting the culture war. Because that feels almost like a rhetorical trick. Yeah. Because it means that if you have anything to say about the culture war, you will be dismissed as a culture warrior.
Yeah, I mean, we've all seen this play out time and time again. It says, we're going to teach 5-year-olds that they've got white privilege, you know, we're going to let people in possession of a penis change next to 12-year-old girls at the swimming pool. And anyone who says, hang on a minute, they're the one who's launching a culture war. We see this time and time again. And I think that's one of the things that we've really got to get past. That's why the culture war is quite important, because it's not settled. People just try to kind of continue to push these particular policies, push this particular ideology and silence any criticism of it. That's why it's flared up as a big issue, and that's why people have got to take it seriously, including these Tory leadership candidates.
Well, I mean, I wrote a piece about this week because I feel that one of the big problems with this culture war discussion is that lots of people reduce it to right versus left. And I don't think that's at all true, more than anything, because the Tories have presided over the worst excesses of the culture war. 100%. I feel like they have been part of the problem. You know, so, you know, they've got this online safety bill where they're using the language of woke activists. They're saying these words are unsafe. That's their lexicon.
That's 100% right. I mean, also, if you think about the gender wars, that was really sparked by this attempted reform to the Gender Recognition Act around self-ID. This was Theresa May's government that introduced this, and I think it was part and parcel of that attempt by the Tory party to kind of challenge this idea of it as the nasty party. As a consequence of that, I think it's ushered in and fuelled an ideology which is really quite nasty and which really wants to get rid of sex-based rights and demonise women, often in quite a misogynistic way if they challenge it. So you're right, a lot of this does come from the Tory party, and that's why I think it's become a big issue in this leadership race. This is also their record. This isn't something from outside of the party.
So when commentators say all of this culture war chat among the candidates is going to shift the party to the right, does that even make sense?
It doesn't make any sense. I mean, obviously there's some people in the right of politics who challenge these culture war issues, but there's people across the political spectrum, especially because what we might talk about when we talk about the culture war or woke ideology, it presents itself as anti-racist, pro-women, pro-equality, pro-togetherness, whatever. It's the complete opposite of all of those things. It wants to usher in a new kind of racial thinking. It wants to tell you that you are completely, again, kind of destined by dint of where you came from in life. And it wants to usher in what I think are some quite misogynistic policies around the trans issue. This isn't a liberal, tolerant or progressive movement by any stretch of the imagination. It's something else. And that's why people left and right, I think, are capable of challenging it, recognising it for what it is.
But it's packaged as progressive.
Yeah.
And the fact that all these feminists who are almost all left-wing are being called far-right because they challenge it. I mean, it means that these designations don't mean anything anymore. But that to me suggests that whoever the next leader is has to tackle this.
Yeah.
We can't keep letting this slide because we're already in a mess.
No, I think that's exactly it. This stuff really matters because it's these big, broader issues we've been talking about, how we see ourselves as a society. It's also a lot of kind of bread and butter, nuts and bolts things, how you understand the inequalities in society and how to deal with it. Telling a 5-year-old white working class boy that he's privileged is nuts. It won't get you anywhere near towards improving that boy's lot in life, let alone the rest of his classmates, whatever background they happen to come from. Same with the issue of women's rights. This is not the question of women's spaces, of refuge centres or whatever. This is not some academic debate that people are having. It has a really serious, tangible impact, and that's why we need to push back this ideology, which is essentially allowing all of these terrible things to happen, in my view.
For all the Conservative talk of a war on woke, they never really waged one. And is it not a bit of a worry that the four running candidates here, Rishi Sunak, Liz Truss, Penny Mordaunt, they're not the ones talking about this stuff. It's Kemi Badenoch mostly talking about this stuff. Should that be a worry to us? Will they ever wake up to the fact that this is something they have to address sooner or later?
I think unless Kemi Badenoch wins this leadership election or has a particularly prominent place in the next government, which could well be a consequence of doing so well, I would worry that wouldn't be the case, or at least that wouldn't set a kind of tone going forward. Not that it's only down to one person to fight this, but I think what we saw with the last government, Boris Johnson is by no means a politically correct man. He is not someone he recognises that a lot of the people who support him is pushing back against a lot of this kind of metropolitan liberal froth, however you might want to call it, and yet he himself was completely incapable of tackling this other than on an occasional sort of rhetorical level. When push came to shove, he couldn't really do anything.
His point about women's rights towards the end of his tenure, didn't he? But that was not the norm.
It wasn't at all. And, you'd also hear him coming out with very odd things from time to time, oddly woke statements from time to time, but not because I thought he really believed in that stuff, because he felt he had to curry favour with that layer of society. But this is much more about... I think the other thing is that people like Boris Johnson, or people just in Tory politics in general, sometimes they're interested in the culture war, but only because they really want to kind of own the libs. They just want to kind of point out how ridiculous these people are being. It's much more serious than that. So you can't just kind of cackle at it from the sidelines, nor can you shy away from it. But I think a lot of the people in this leadership debate would rather it just went away, and it's not going to go away.
Well, that's the question, isn't it? If you just ignore it, it doesn't go away. Even if you try and do something about it, when you have the High Court's saying that the recording of non-crime hate incidents is in fact unlawful, and Priti Patel is saying to the College of Policing it's unlawful, they still carry on.
Yeah.
They don't care. So clearly it's going to take quite a tough leader to deal with the quangos and the various people who are perpetuating this stuff.
And the civil service. I mean, that was one thing that Kemi Badenoch mentioned the other day, which was when, very late in the day of the last government, in her brief, she brought forward this measure that would essentially make sure that there were sex-based different toilets, essentially, in public buildings, and that civil servants pushed back and said, we're not sure that this is appropriate language. I mean, this sort of thing is just throughout the whole kind of system.
And that's particularly worrying the civil service. If the machinery of government is like this, is against free speech, is against the idea of acknowledging truth, it doesn't matter if it's Tories or Labour in power, you're still going to get the same stuff.
Exactly, and that's why you have to take it very seriously, and that's why I think also people have to go on the offensive in relation to this stuff. I'm not saying going around trying to upset people by being as provocative as possible, but what I mean is taking on this ideology head on, trying to actually take it apart, trying to recognise where it is exerting kind of anti-democratic influence and trying to tackle that, because otherwise it will just inevitably slowly flow through our institutions, because this is the sort of thing that a lot of people in that kind of professional managerial class just naturally believe. So unless you push back on it, it will just become the orthodoxy, despite the fact it's such a small amount of people in the grand scheme of things who believe in all this stuff.